Hello, and I'm back for a brief moment between the Gladiator Tournament coverage to bring you yet another micro lesson. This one's on traffic areas and how they can be used to make a more predictable fortress as well as appease those OSHA clipboard jockeys. Let's kick it off with a brief explanation of what a traffic area is and what it means. In Dwarf Fortress, dwarves count their steps when they walk to and fro, and they pick the path that requires the least walking. But sometimes that path is a stupid path. A very, very stupid path. Lucky for us, we have a neat little tool that allows us to mess with these calculations and influence how our dwarves choose their paths. This tool is the Traffic Designations menu, accessed by pressing D and then O. How does it work? Well, it's actually very simple, yet powerful. There are 4 levels of priority to select from: high, normal, low, and restricted, and the difference between them is very plain. See, each square has a cost of movement. Dwarves count the square as that many steps, so to speak, so a normal square counts as 2 steps, while a high traffic square costs only 1, and a restricted square costs 25. By creating a traffic area, you change how many steps the squares in that area cost, and thus change how your dwarves will choose to move around. Now you may be confused about one thing already. Here it says high traffic cost, but the cost is the lowest. This is simply a matter of odd verbiage in the UI. What it means is the cost of a high traffic area, not the area that's of high cost. You can change these costs if you'd like, but I don't know if I've ever encountered a need to do so, or if anyone ever will, as they work pretty well as they are. With the menu explained now, what exactly can we do with this? To start, let's establish some basic dwarven safety in our tutorial fort. We have seasonal freezing here, so dwarves are at risk of walking over ice as it thaws. Furthermore, I have floodgates damming the river some of the time, so dwarves may be tempted to walk through the dry riverbed exactly as I reopen the floodgates, of course. So to keep dwarves out of these places, we can draw a restricted traffic area on both the river's surface as well as the riverbed 1Z level down. We leave the bridge as a normal cost, and now the dwarves will prefer to cross there. But how strongly do they prefer if it's not strictly forbidden? Well, that's where the cost comes in. The shortest path across the river is 3 squares. Let's not talk about the diagonals. And each square has now been changed to a cost of 25 steps. So dwarves will count this crossing as 75 steps. The bridge, on the other hand, costs 2 steps each square and is 4 steps across the river for a total of 8 steps. So between 75 and 8 steps, there's a massive preference to take the bridge. Doing some math, we can determine that an alternative route would have to shave off 34 squares to be of equal preference. And as I said before, you can change these values to make the preference even stronger. For example, if each restricted square costs 500 steps. Alternatively, you can create a high traffic area to herd dwarves towards the bridge, and thus make it less likely that any other crossing is much shorter. That's enough about bridges though. There's some handy tricks hidden in this tool. Another use for it is in preventing dwarves from becoming trapped in an enclosed construction. I used this exact trick to wall in these light shafts on the surface. How I did this is, after designating the constructions, I created a restricted zone over the enclosed area as well as the walls. Now as dwarves bring materials to the walls, they'll avoid standing inside of the area or where other walls will be built, and won't walk through the area before or after building either. In this live-action reenactment, we can observe the clueless dwarves working in a surprisingly safe manner. One more example of traffic areas in action is keeping traveling dwarves out of workshops and other places not meant for general traffic. Let's take a look at the kitchen and wine cellar. There's this very convenient vertical path that leads down from the kitchen through the wine cellar and into the tavern. Combined with the presence of food and drink in these areas, it's enticing for dwarves to wander through them, to move around or perhaps eat something that's closer to them than the tavern is. To prevent this, and keep the dwarves on a more predictable and intentional path, we can simply mark the entire workshop room as restricted. Again, we're working with preference rather than blatantly forbidding areas. See, the dwarves who work in these areas don't have a choice but to walk through them. Also, the squares don't actually take longer to walk through, so the workers' behavior is essentially unchanged. They must walk to the workshop and then to the stockpiles and back. For other dwarves, however, walking through these rooms is now extremely expensive steps-wise, so the average Urist will now prefer to simply walk the hallways to the tavern and eat there. Now you may have noticed that I've only been using the restricted zone. Well, that's because this zone type is all you need for the majority of use cases, simply to have an area dwarves don't want to go. You can incorporate other priority levels to manage dwarves more closely. For example, you can establish a high traffic area for wide hallways that can handle a lot of traffic, leaving the narrower corridors to handle less. You can also create a low traffic area over most of the surface, with a high traffic area on a road. This way, dwarves will have a high preference for staying off of the grass, but not so much that they'll waste their day walking around the whole map to avoid it. And that's about all I'll say regarding traffic areas. There's currently 6 examples on the wiki of how to use them if you're interested in more ideas. It's an extremely handy tool to have when you need it. Like standing orders, traffic areas are not needed often enough to be on the average player's radar, but everyone encounters a good time to use them, so everyone should know that they exist. I'll be back next time with something else, probably.